Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series on the global history of capitalism. And today I'm going to talk about a book by Andrew Liu called Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. And what Liu tries to do in this book, I think quite successfully, is to trace the introduction and development of capitalism in these two countries, in China and India, through the history of tea production and trade. And in the 19th century, both India and China had one very important thing in common, and that is that they were in many cases, kind of forcefully from the outside, worked into the global capitalist economy as a major producer and supplier of tea. And their economies developed in many ways around this key essential commodity there. And then through this, this was also how capitalism was largely developed there. So there's this very important commonality between the two places, and there's a lot of overlap, as Liu shows, points of divergence as well, which we'll look at. But it's a really interesting history, and it's, I think, a great book. Liu handles it really well. So I'm going to try to just summarize and kind of analyze the contents of his book in detail and try to give you guys and try to introduce this topic to you as well, right? Okay, and get into the presentation here. So basically, here we go. I have my simple introductory slide here. Andrew Liu's Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. And, you know, just before I really get started on the main topic, some of you have asked me, Justin, what do you mean capitalism in China? This doesn't make any sense. I thought China was a socialist economy, and so explain what's going on here, right? Well, China is a capitalist country, and it's fully integrated into the capitalist system. It produces goods for the capitalist market. And in order to understand more about capitalism in China today, it's necessary to, I think, study arguments about Trotskyist arguments, especially about what state capitalism is and how the state can act as a single capitalist, basically. So it exploits labor. It exploits surplus value to produce goods, which it sells to the global market. And in the process, it accumulates capital. Okay? Now, there's a great talk that I just watched about the subject of state capitalism by Owen Miller from the University of London. And he goes into more detail about this, about how theories of state capitalism were developed. So I would recommend taking a look at that first in order to understand the role that China plays in the global capitalist economy. Also, it's important to understand how there is a global division of labor in place that supports the capitalist economy, where some regions, the capitalist economy will exploit or extract labor or resources from certain regions and export them to other regions. which act mainly as buyers, for instance, and whatnot. So there's a whole history there. But you know what? Actually, that is basically for our discussion today a separate topic, okay? Because what we're looking at today is the 19th century history, okay? So 19th century China and the introductions and origins of capitalism there. Okay, now at this time, it's basically this is, I think, is especially even more undisputable that even before China became a so-called socialist country, that it was a capitalist country. Okay, so let's look at this in more detail, how this came about. And Liu starts out saying right in the beginning that this book sets out to tell the story of the global tea trade as a history of emergent capitalism in modern China and India. So great to take his words there. He can explain what he's trying to do much better than I can, and I think this sentence sums it up pretty well. And then he explains how tea exports rose in China in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, but then there's a precipitous decline, and there was a simultaneous boom in Indian tea production from between the 1880s and the 1910s, and that mirrored this decline in China. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to show these two competing tea economies kind of mirror the rise and fall of each other, right? And so what this demonstrates is how interconnected they are through the global capitalist economy. And in Great Britain, now, one important thing to remember, that India was a colony of Great Britain at this time. And so propagandists in Great Britain they pointed to this rise in tea production in India to say, look, the British Empire is so great because we're raising productivity, right? We're lifting the Indian economy out of feudalism or poverty or something like this. This is what they would say, yeah? And then they would also point to China, and they would say, look, China, it's not a colony, really, and I guess, directly of anywhere at this time, and it still has the Qing dynasty there, and so it's still kind of so-called feudal and backwards. It fails to modernize, and so that's why its tea production is declining, right? That's what they said, okay? Now, the reality, of course, is much different, but we'll look at that in a minute. But anyway, this tea history shows this fierce economic competition. So Tea Wars is an apt title for this book. And the history of tea is integral to understand the formation of modern capitalism in those countries. Now, there are some differences, though. Some similarities, but some differences. One big difference is that in India, much of this boom, and this contradicts what the propagandists say. It's not their superior rule or technology that they implement. No. All of this, boom in production and increase in capital is as a result of labor, of course, and especially the heavy use of what was called coolie labor. Now, this is basically unfree, indentured servitude, okay? Laborers could not leave. They were on fixed contracts. And Indian nationalists actually picked up on this, and they picked up on the labor theory of value as well, and used this to decry coolie labor as being feudal, as being backwards, and they demanded free, quote, free wage labor to make India into a more modern capitalist nation. But what everyone overlooks in this process is that coolie labor was fundamental to the development of capitalism in India, and that it was fundamental to the process of capital accumulation. Okay, so both parties are kind of overlooking this key aspect of how capitalism works. Meanwhile, in China, nationalists there decried the feudal system, what they called the feudal system as well, and this old feudal means of technology or production that were supposedly holding them back. So they kind of bought into this argument as well. They would say, look, yeah, you're right. Great Britain in India, they introduced this modernizing technology, and that's why tea production is, booming and whatnot. And he said, then Liu says anyway, that this system of transnational competition best explains the, quote, historical dynamics of capital accumulation. And he argues that labor-intensive, quote, traditional production methods were actually essential for primitive accumulation. So it's not just, it's labor-intensive, of course, but that what is so interesting is that he looks at these different forms of regulating production and different pieces of very old technology that were used to produce tea, and then how those kind of older means of technology were actually used in different ways to facilitate capital accumulation, right? And this contradicts the argument at the time, which critiqued the coolie worker in India and the, quote, parasitic comprador merchants in China as backward stumbling blocks to capitalist modernity. So, and then he goes into some background a little bit, and he's still talking in the introduction here, but the Great Britain East India Company sold and cultivated opium in India in exchange for Chinese tea in Canton between 1700 and 1842. And there was also, there began to be a tea craze in Great Britain. Tea becomes very popular in Great Britain and throughout Europe. And then people there drink tea that's sweetened with sugar. And sugar, of course, at this time comes mainly from the West Indies, where, in the Caribbean, where it's harvested by slaves. So slavery, by the way, is lingering in the background here throughout Liu's book. And we're going to look at this in a future talk, how slavery as well functioned in the global capitalist economy. But in Liu's book, it's kind of in the background always. But other non-East India Company merchants, British merchants, of course, they resent the monopoly that the East India Company has in Canton over the tea trade in China, and they demand that the Qing government open up new ports, or that they be allowed to harvest, or they argued to British politicians that they be allowed to harvest tea elsewhere in the empire. And both of these aims and arguments were accepted and achieved. So the first aim was achieved with the Opium War. And this was then, after this, the high point in the Chinese tea trade, right? And then the second aim was achieved in India, where in 1860 the colonial government passed laws prohibiting coolie workers from leaving employment, i.e. indentured servitude. So the East India Company, anyway, loses its monopoly over the tea trade in Canton through the Opium War, and then British tea planters, are allowed to expand the tea trade in India as well. And then eventually, Indian tea production and exports begin to surpass those of China. In 1889, tea becomes the most valuable export for both China and India. So it's a fundamental, it's a key commodity for both of their emerging capitalist economies. The Chinese tea trade kept alive Caribbean slavery through the high demand for sugar that was used when people drank tea. So this demonstrates as well how all commodities are connected in this global system. And then it's also traded for cotton grown by U.S. slaves. So Liu says this thus creates the quote, first global division of labor. And he argues against the idea that capitalism emerged, quote, as a result of sudden and local innovations in England. Now, I think for the most part, Liu is basically in agreement with a lot of Marxist scholars, and he uses a lot of Marxist scholarship as well throughout the book, including Moishe Postone and Harry Braverman and others. But this might, sometimes what he says seems to be a little bit different from scholars, for instance, Ellen Makes and Wood, as we looked at earlier. But I would say mostly, even though he writes this at one point, I would say mostly he's generally in agreement with other scholars that, and especially on the point that of the agrarian origins of capitalism. So regardless of where it first emerged, and I think he kind of does basically accept that, these first social relations, capitalist social relations, emerged in England, and market imperatives developed there, and then they spread around the world. And this is clearly evidenced, in the importance of tea to the global economy. But I think more even importantly, and what's so interesting about Liu's book, is how he shows how these agrarian origins looked very different, and they took very different forms, and there are different ways of primitive accumulation that happened in these different countries. And we've already seen this in Japan as well in one of our previous lectures. So he also says that non-Western nations relied heavily on traditional hierarchies and patterns of production in their incorporation of capitalism. This is true for Japan as well. And he's not focused on capitalist industry, but on the ideology to, quote, endlessly accumulate profit for its own sake. So it's a fairly concise definition of, partial definition of capitalism there as well. And so he defines capitalism then, anyway, as this relentless underlying drive to raise productivity as well. And he notes the importance of wage-based production, where workers produce for the market rather than for their own needs. So all of these things distinguish capitalist economies, right? And I just want to show a graph here, and I'm just taking this directly copied from the book on page 2, where he just shows tea production, tea exports in both places. And the dotted line here is in China, and the solid line is Indian tea exports. And you can see how their rise and fall basically mirrors each other as inverse. And so right around 1900, there's this shift that takes place. Okay, so this is important, and we'll keep coming back to this. And Liu continues to explain in the introduction, more about how capitalism works. And of course, in capitalism, the value of labor is a measurement of time. So this is socially necessary labor time. So merchants become preoccupied with measuring time to the time that it takes to manufacture commodities. And what's so interesting about the two regions that Liu is looking at is that they use traditional methods to measure time. For example, incense sticks or gongs. Okay, so there's these older pieces of technology that are being incorporated into primitive accumulation and used in new ways to measure time, for instance. So the importance of socially necessary labor time and the value of commodities is determined by the time it takes in society as a whole to make similar ones, because they're competing against each other. How fast is my competitor making it, right? Because that determines the value of it overall. If I'm making it much slower than my competitor, this is a big loss, right? So this is how the value of commodities is determined. And this ties Chinese and Indian competition together into a global capitalist system, which relies on the idea of market dependence as well. So Liu argues against an image of just modern industrial capitalism, and instead advocates moving towards its origins, its traditional social arrangements, wage labor, and market dependence. This is important because, as I've said, China and India relied on traditional hierarchical relations to further primitive accumulation and capital accumulation. For example, master-servant laws in India, old loan systems, and village authority. But they relied on new forms of labor-intensive work to create massive surplus value, too. So Liu says that the labor theory of value does apply to Asia, and it's not just culturally specific to Europe, as some say. I don't really know who says this anymore anyway, but, anyway, Liu's pointing out that he's arguing against this. And he said he notes that the importance of abstract labor and how it connects labor value and prices globally. And in China and India, different nationalist groups or anti-colonialists pick up on liberal notions of free wage labor to criticize traditional methods, hierarchies, and colonialism as backwards and feudal. So they borrow these liberal ideas, which also advocate, liberal capitalism as well. And they use this to basically, it's not just an anti-colonial movement, nationalist movement, but also they're modernizing movements, and their understanding of modernity is equal to liberal capitalism, basically. And they say these old methods of, exploitation or whatever are indemnical to capitalism. They don't, they're incompatible with capitalism. Yeah. But of course, as I mentioned, what they fail to realize is that they're not they're not incompatible with capitalism. They're rather essential to maintain capitalist economies. Okay, so getting into the good stuff here, Chapter 1, the two tea countries. A brief history of the global tea trade. Liu notes the development of black tea in the 19th century is indicative of global connections emerging in the tea market. And the Dutch East India Company were the first to buy tea in Hirado, Japan in 1609. The English East India Company formed in 1600 and monopolized the tea trade with Qing China. In so just to indicate the then explosive growth of the tea market at this time, in 1712, there were 156,000 pounds being produced, and in 1738, it jumped to 3 million. And there was also tea was being smuggled as well. So these East India companies monopolizing the tea trade, but other companies are smuggling it as well, so production was probably actually even higher. Heavy taxes on tea were used to finance Britain's wars throughout the empire. At the same time, smuggled tea grew from 7 versus 5 million pounds a year. Okay, I don't really know what that means, but okay, this grew by, the millions as well, I guess, from this time is what he's saying. Then tax laws were weakened and the East India Company monopoly grew even further. So by 1833, 33 million, it's producing 33 millions of pounds of tea per year. The Ming and the Qing dynasties in China highly valued silver, and they value it at about 2 times the value of the rest of the world. So Britain would funnel silver into China in return for tea, which had 7 times its value in Europe. So this is just, basically getting creating wealth through the circulation of goods, through buying low and selling high, something like that, right? So not capitalism yet, but this is how wealth was kind of generated, or profit was generated, I should say. But the English East India Company then would grow opium in India and trade this for Chinese tea, which would then drain the silver back out of China as well. So it's buying tea with silver, and then it's selling opium to China and getting, in exchange, I think this should be probably for silver, and then that would drain the silver back out of China. So it's a very exploitative trade relationship here, of course. Great Britain also got raw cotton from India, and then would ship this to England, where it would be manufactured into different, different clothes or whatever, and then exported around the world, including to China. Tea was also tied with sugar grown on slave plantations, as I've mentioned, and tea consumption grew among the European working class too, and was advocated even by prohibitionists. This is kind of interesting. Capitalists and capitalist economy, I think, still basically favors stimulants such as tea and coffee, and in certain cases, in certain countries, such as Japan, methamphetamines even, over alcohol and other kinds of drugs with different effects, because they are more conducive to regular and constant work. So, interesting side there. So tea trade sales helped produce the profits that modern industrial capitalism was built on, in Great Britain especially. And in 1833, Great Britain broke the East India Company monopoly in the Canton trade, and then British traders flooded into China. The Qing government banned opium imports in 1839, which led to the Opium War and then the treaty port system, since the Qing government lost, China lost that war, and then was forced to open even more ports for this very exploitative trade. The Mughal Empire ruled South Asia until, so now this is looking at, shifting gears and looking at India, situation there. The Mughal Empire ruled South Asia until 1857, and it collected taxes through top officials called Diwani. In 1765, the East India Company captured the title of Diwani. And then after 10 years battle around Bengal, Great Britain established colonial rule in India. So there was opposition to the East India Company's use of capturing the title of Diwani, leading to war and then colonial rule from there. Meanwhile, in the 1830s, Britain began experimenting with tea production in India, and British planters turned to the Assam region, which had somewhat of a tea tradition anyway. There wasn't much tea production or much of a tea culture really to speak of in India at this time, but in the Assam region there was some, so planters tried to basically work from there and expand that. World commodities relied on global exploitation, and there was a shift from trade to capitalism. There was always trade throughout history, but this usually was only in luxury goods, and it only began to affect staple commodities that workers depended on in the 19th century. Note that the former has a higher price than the latter, of course, and it's the same situation with tea. It started out as a luxury commodity and had a very high price in the 18th century, but then in the 19th century it became an essential good, basically, so prices fell. This resulted in a global division of labor and production to produce more faster, and it paved the way for industrialization too. So that's just a final closing then that Liu gives in this chapter. And then in chapter 2, he looks at it's called Incense and Industry, Labor-Intensive Capital Accumulation in the Tea Districts of Huizhou and the Wuyi Mountains. Tea exports boomed in the first part of the 19th century China. Now, there was no real technological breakthrough. Rather, producers relied more on labor-intensive output and an increase in productivity to compete. So there's this stereotype that was even advocated by Chinese reformists and nationalists at the time of China as being backwards, of the Qing government as being backwards and not innovating. But China actually did increase production. It was just through labor-intensive accumulation. And moreover, now this is the important part really, because this idea of labor-intensive accumulation, of producing for a global market based on market imperatives, where prices are determined by mechanisms outside of people's control and everyone has to sell their labor for the market, etc., etc. This was not traditional, but it was a distinctly modern, market-driven strategy. So this immediately counters the arguments put forward that by Chinese nationalists that China was some backwards country, right? And there was also a great effort to minimize wasted time. There was a piece wage system as well, and incense sticks were used to measure time. Liu talks about 3 phases in Chinese tea production then. So this is how, typically this kind of tea production operated. And then this is important for understanding how these subtle transformations in the industry took place. So what would happen is peasant producers would sell to guest merchants. Sorry, this is, I'm looking at, I misspoke. These are 3 phases in tea production. What am I trying to say? Kind of temporally, right? So he's looking at 3 different time periods in production. So at first, peasant producers would sell to guest merchants. But then, the second phase, in the 19th century, merchants became more involved in production. And then third, eventually merchants took over the responsibility of production entirely. So this is how the tea industry transformed throughout this time. And looking at more detail, during this first phase, merchants traded locally harvested teas between regions, while they played little to no role in the actual production, and they also brought minimal capital investment into the production process. He looks at an example of the Jiang family merchant records, so a merchant family from Huizhou, which was a major tea producing area. And then they would bring the tea to Canton. They would visit the region of Huizhou and buy the tea there and then bring it back to Canton and sell it to these the Canton merchants. So the Jiang family they were guest traders, what was called guest traders, because they didn't live in the area where tea was produced and they invested little in labor. They just transported the tea basically and then tried to buy it low and then sell at a higher price. And the inland merchants who carried, so there's a distinction then between inland merchants who carried the tea to the coast and coastal merchants. And the latter are the rich and powerful merchants who control the foreign trade, and they also lend loans to inland merchants. During the second phase, Westerners who are buying the tea in Canton come to see the coastal merchants as like leechers or parasites or middlemen or even competitors whose role is basically unnecessary in the production of tea. So the role of the inland guest merchants increased from this time. They became less just transporters and more managers concerned with increasing production, which then leads to the third period where inland merchants like Jiang Yaohua settled down in the tea-producing regions in Huizhou and opened their own manufacturing plants and shops. I should say, by the way, I apologize for my terrible pronunciation of Chinese names and places. I'm not a Chinese speaker, unfortunately. I wish I was, but I'm not. Okay. And then Liu talks about there were seasonal tea industry booms where a migrant workforce would also boom alongside this. And this is all happening after the Canton clique was broken up, after the Opium War. And so from this point, almost everyone in some way became involved with the tea trade. There were small producers, factory capitalists, merchants like the Jiang family, and he also looks at another example. Oh, sorry, this should be not G, but J, Jiang Yuhua. Jiang Yuhua from the 1860s ran a tea shop in Suzhou. And he saved money and borrowed capital to open a tea factory in Huizhou and another big shop there. So this is demonstrating the change from this guest merchant to then becoming actual producer. In late 19th century, tea factories employed between 100 to 1,000 people each season. Because the guest merchants were traveling back and forth and acting as brokers, but they were also running manufacture, the lines between merchant and industrial capital were kind of blurred at this time. Liu talks about how capitalism and the capitalist division of labor upended or it undermined traditional Confucian gender norms. Men and women would work side by side, and women also usually picked the leaves while men roasted. This was kind of more of a traditional division of labor, but capitalist division of labor was less concerned with this, and it employed both sexes for various different jobs. And this really disturbed Confucian moralists. They thought that doing such manly work could ruin, quote, feminine virtues. And note that similar in many ways to the situation today, women then also had a double duty of wage work and housework. So wage work, we have to remember here, many times we are stuck in this way of thinking where we think like, oh yeah, capitalism, it's got a lot of bad points, but it was also liberating for people, right? Because it gave them a job or something like that, or it allowed them to get out of the house or something like this, right? And so people often point at what a portion of the female population is employed in wage labor, right? As some kind of indicator of female liberation. But we have to keep in mind that at this time, especially, wage work is not liberating for women because they have this double duty. The end of the Canton cohort then led to increased competition and falling prices. Merchants no longer benefited from buying low and selling high. This is also important. This led them as well during the second phase to focus more on then increasing productivity to make profit. Chinese merchants struggled with fluctuating prices from raw materials in the mountain harvest and foreign buyers who haggled against the price of Indian tea too. So merchants moved to control production costs, as I mentioned, and he looks at the example again of Jiang Yaohua, who wrote a textbook on tea production. And this is a great source that Liu looks at in more detail later. And he described the use of incense sticks to measure time. So for one stick, it burned for 40 minutes. And these had been used since the 6th century for a long time. But of course, in pre-capitalist societies, even though there are these methods that existed, they weren't really employed on a large scale. And so mostly, farmers went about their day based on the natural rhythms of the seasons. And this is like natural time, okay? But with capitalism, there's a shift to abstract time. Measuring time, which is, I've explained in previous lectures, but simply here, measuring time independent of events and natural cycles. And this shift was more subtle and used traditional methods like incense sticks. And this is all about maximizing time spent on production and the workday. So you can see how these traditional technologies are used already in very different ways, this distinction between different kinds of time and the shift to measuring abstract time. Okay, so the average workday then would last for 18 incense sticks, which was long, grueling hours from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. And roasters had the hardest job, basically. So there would be roasting the tea leaves. So there would be 6 roasting cycles in a day. There was then this change already then of how long, from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. of 6 roasting cycles a day, etc., and how much should be able to produce during that time. So there's this change from concrete to abstract time. And previously, production time would be measured based on how long it takes to do a task, but with abstract time, now it's measured on how long it should take to perform a task. So time and task are inverted. Normally, right, when we work, we say, oh, it took me this long to make something. But no, capitalist abstract time says it should take you this long to make this much. Okay, so the time is already measured in advance, or as a known unit in advance, right? And wages then were determined by the number of baskets a worker would produce in a given shift. So for example, 2 or 4 baskets. But the price of a basket was still determined by the going rate, i.e. abstract labor, and thus was a function of time. So even though all workers then would work the same amount of hours, if everyone on a tea plantation worked the same amount of hours, those who produced more were paid more. Here's an example of a short excerpt from T-War describing the very harsh conditions that of tea people engaged in tea production, tea workers. But due to time constraints, I'm going to skip over this, and for people in my class, we can read this in detail later. I'll provide the materials for this. Okay, the hardest work was saved for women and migrant workers, who were also, unsurprisingly, paid the least. They were also not provided lodging, so they had to pay for this as well from their wages. And it wasn't just incense sticks that were used either. There were other traditional methods employed in capitalist ways of production as well. The next example, this should be, what Liu looks at is the cliff factories of Fujian. And there were over 130 of these in the 19th century. And a typical plantation then would involve merchants and overseers called baotou and workers. And the overseers relied on local traditions especially to increase production. For example, the legend of the mythical founder of Wuyi tea, Yang Taibai. He became a mountain god, according to legend. And so tea workers, as they're picking tea leaves, for example, on the mountainside, would be prohibited from talking, and in many cases even turning around, since this could bring about the wrath of the mountain god. So these kind of old myths are used in new ways to incite people to work harder. Pickers had the hardest job and conditions in the Wuyi Mountains, and they were also it was also monitored where they ate, and apparently this was, as well, these overseers would say, an ancient rule set down by the gods. There was the use of abstract time as well, by periodically weighing how much pickers had picked, and workers who picked lots of spelling errors in this, were shamed by having to carry a red flag down the mountain at night. Workers picked from 5 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then spent part of the night roasting as well, so sometimes would go nonstop, 24 hours working. So in conclusion, Liu says that capitalism in China was introduced through market imperatives. There was a population growth and an increase in productivity, but full mechanization and industrialization didn't immediately follow. And he's shown through some examples how Chinese tea producers relied on traditional methods to increase productivity and to introduce abstract time. Okay, then he looks at the situation in India. Chapter 3 is called A Crisis of Classical Political Economy in Assam, From Economic Liberalism to a Theory of Colonization, 1834 to 1862. So British planters were worried about the Chinese monopoly on tea, as mentioned in the introduction. They wanted to expand the tea tea production into India and to strengthen the British Empire as well. But India didn't have a strong tea culture, as I mentioned, and tea production there was, really small scale. So there was a tea committee formed in the British government, which brought tea cultivators from China to India to develop the industry there. And then in the 1860s, officials legalized penal labor contracts that prevented migrant Indian workers from leaving employment. By the late 19th century, then there were nearly 500,000 workers in Assam. But of course, policies of indentured labor were in theory opposed to the principles of economic liberalism. And this caused somewhat of a crisis of classical liberal political economy, because planters wanted more state control. They wanted more state and colonial control in England. They wanted the state to implement these penal labor contracts, for example, to oppose these newly emerging ideas of classical political economy and liberalism. So at first, planters advocated liberalism by saying, let's expand the economy, the tea economy in India. And this will be great for everyone there because it'll be the, quote, free market. But eventually, they then abandoned this for illiberal ideas of unfree labor. The British annexed Assam, the Assam region, in 1826 under David Scott. And at first they tried the free market capitalism there, but unfortunately didn't go too well. And so Scott argued for a more interventionist approach. But not all favored this, because Assam and India were ruled by the East India Company at first, and it went against kind of tenets of liberal political economy, as I mentioned. And Adam Smith, for example, too, was opposed to the East India Company in general because it was a monopoly and it ruled India. But the East India Company used his arguments to argue that it was setting up a free economy, quote, free economy in India. Also, they emphasized his idea of improvement. So these different groups are using these kind of ideas of economic liberalism in different ways. And public opinion eventually shifted to be in favor, this is public opinion in Britain, of course, shifted in favor of colonization in India and setting up a capitalist, quote, free market there. And there was also a need for Britain for direct investment from Britain in India, because India did not have enough capital. There's not enough initial capital to reproduce more capital. So something needs to provide that initial investment, people argued. And colonialists saw India as being backwards and feudal. This was also, they saw this as a hindrance to capitalism, of course. And so they thought that introducing tea there would be a way to kind of liberate India and to nurture the, quote, law of free trade. So I mentioned David Scott, his successor was Francis Jenkins, and he and Great Britain, many British leaders, sought a new cash crop to improve, quote, improve Indian economy and culture. And William Bentinck was the advisor to the East India Company in India at this time. Okay, that's kind of a random statement, but whatever. So anyway, this was not a free, but a planned economy from the start. And the Tea Committee founded gardens and imported plants from China and brought in workers between 1834 and 1839. Charles Bruce was a member of the Tea Committee, and he learned how to cultivate tea from Chinese producers. Also, there's some support for bringing Chinese workers and producers to instruct the local population in Assam. This was supposed to be, it was pitched as free immigration. And it also meshed with ideas of the, quote, free market, because Britain was seen as less interventionist and just more of lending a, quote, helping hand. The Tea Committee mostly got tracts of land in Assam or gets most of the tracts of land in Assam, I should say, and also it starts with 160,000 plants, which could produce 4,000 pounds of tea per year, I guess. And this was in 1840, and then they were renamed the Assam Company. The Tea Committee was renamed the Assam Company. So the Assam Company abandoned eventually Chinese methods and workers, but they couldn't attract enough workers at first because locals would often leave for their own homes. Even if they were working there seasonally, they'd just go back, when the job was done. And the Assam Company also, the wages they paid were not high enough to compete with other forms of employment. So it wasn't that there weren't enough workers, but it was just that there wasn't enough cheap labor. Or you could rephrase this as saying they were not extracting enough surplus labor from their constant to variable capital ratio. And they called this a shortage of labor, but what they really meant is a shortage of cheap labor or surplus value. This is also an interesting aside, but usually when capitalists talk about a labor shortage, what they really mean is not necessarily a shortage of people per se. There's just a shortage of cheap labor is what they mean. And this almost ruined the Assam Company. Then in 1857 through 1859, there was a Sepoy Mutiny and a revolt against British rule in India. The people rebelling against colonialism lost, and colonial control transferred from the East India Company to the British Crown. And this also led British leaders and officials to abandon many ideas of economic liberalism, which they initially held on to. They switched from universalist views to cultural ideas of kind of culturalism. And they started to see and talk about, use this discourse of India as being permanently backwards, and also supported a shift to indentured tea labor then. So this was the background for these British colonial government in India implementing these penal contracts and unfree labor. One person who argued in favor of government intervention was William Nassan Lee. He argued in favor of colonialization and indentured labor too, and against ideas of laissez-faire economics. He borrowed from the ideas of Henry Maine, who argued that it was wrong to try to apply liberal standards in Asia. And he also argued against communal ownership and for private property. Both these individuals were very racist against Indians and other non-whites. They said that it was a mistake to apply British laws to India as well, and they argued for a, quote, scientific view, which appreciated differences in race and culture. So abandoning these kind of ideas and other, that were related to ideas of liberalism, including universalism and other ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. They also borrowed from Adam Smith's labor theory of value to say that governments must regulate labor to create more capital and surplus value. And this, in their view, required colonialism. And Maine and Lee said that Great Britain and the tea industry should have binding contracts, not be based on free labor, but have binding contracts. And this had to do with the fact that Assam, as I mentioned, was underpopulated compared to other areas in India. But workers from elsewhere were too poor to travel, so this was more motivation for this contract law. And Lees admitted that this was slavery, basically. So slavery is being used in India to facilitate the primitive accumulation of capital. Okay, and we'll see this especially in the Americas in our next lecture. Adam Smith and others, of course, offered no theory of primitive accumulation, and this is what we've been talking about, especially in this class, but Marx did, and he showed how, while colonialism and imperialism went against, in theory, ideas of liberal political economy, they actually meshed with and explained the origins of capitalism. And Smith and Marx actually saw value, too, as not just physical things, but also, but as something that rather emerged out of social relations. So this was another important idea shared by many thinkers at the time who were attracted to the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value, as I mentioned before, is frequently misunderstood and mistakenly attributed to Marx. It was not Marx's idea initially. It was a fundamental idea of classical liberal political economy, but it was developed in fundamental ways by Marx. Okay, in chapter 4, Liu continues to talk about tea production in India, and it's titled After the Great Smash, Tea Mania, Overseas Capital, and Labor Intensification in Assam. By the late 19th century, Indian tea had overtaken Chinese tea production. The Indian Tea Association was tasked with advertising tea abroad, and it pitched this boom in Indian tea production as a victory of advanced Western capitalism over backwards pre-capitalist China, even though it was rooted in unfree labor and slavery. Privately, Indian capitalists, though, acknowledged the truth of why it was booming so much and where all their surplus value was coming from. So I've talked about the penal contract laws, but to look at them in more detail, this really came about in 1865, and they restricted workers' movements and their wages were fixed. And then from this exploited labor, tea production skyrocketed to over 60 million pounds per year. And the whole example of these penal contract laws shows how liberal ideas of free labor were always, from the beginning, a myth. Okay, and also it shows the shift from unfree labor. The shift from unfree labor shows a shift from independent gardens to managerial agencies as well. Moreover, the increase in surplus value due mainly to variable capital and not constant capital, meaning that capitalists weren't in a hurry to, quote, modernize technology, and that technology was the result of social transformations and not the cause. And this is also a fundamental point. Right, that it's transformed social relations that give rise to these new forms of technology, and not vice versa. And then also all of this focus on modernization, on new technology, on high technology, increasing production. This is also a myth, okay? Because capitalists are not interested in introducing new technology per se. They're interested in, as I've explained before, the ratio between V to C. They don't want a lot of high overhead of constant capital. They're not going to buy a bunch of expensive machines if there's nobody to operate them, right? Okay, so in many cases, facilitates capital accumulation more to have very labor-intensive means of production to employ a lot of people who are working in very exploited conditions with the minimal amount, the bare necessity of technology. And this facilitates more capital accumulation. So beginning in the 1860s, there was a bunch of land and capital, but they couldn't be expanded. Why? Because only labor can create more capital surplus value. So the Governor General sold off land to private companies on the cheap. This created a speculative bubble, and many local Assam residents were kicked off their property in the process, another form of primitive accumulation. Moreover, companies often just bought land and then sold it later at a higher price without developing it. So again, people still latch on to this myth that capitalism is, even though it advocates, quote, improvement, in many cases it pays more not to improve things. or even develop them. So Assam tea attracted investors and paid out dividends much like a railway before it was built. And it was all based on the prospect of future cultivation. Well, the bubble peaked and collapsed in 1866, and this solidified the idea that there was a labor shortage in Assam. Also, many small capitalists folded here, and then there was more centralization around bigger capitalist companies and fewer concentration in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalist companies there. The Indian governor passed labor indenture laws in 1868 through 1862 as well that added on to these initial penal contract laws, which made, for example, a breach in contract a criminal offense. And then these managing agency houses as well turned into giant megacorps which controlled all aspects of production, including banking, shipping, and insurance services. So the managing agencies combined manufacture and trade, and this mirrored the rise of finance capital in Great Britain, like the Rothschilds as well. They invested heavily in Indian tea, and Indian tea went on to become the biggest commodity of the Indian economy. The largest company was Finlay and Muir Company. As I mentioned, planters, it should be, or I guess could also be planners, love to portray the high technology of Indian tea production versus the, quote, low technology of Chinese tea production. But, as I've noted, this was just a myth, and they privately acknowledged the truth, that this was just a self-justifying argument for colonialism and was largely untrue. Indeed, it was hard to mechanize some aspects of tea production, and technology in many cases was not introduced until much later. So planters increased productivity through relative surplus labor time. As I've mentioned, labor-intensive methods such as working harder, faster, and more intensely. They also cut wages under the penal contract laws as well, and planters paid less than half of the going rate in other industries. The labor force grew every year between 1870 and the early 20th century. So there was a very high portion of variable capital, low portion of constant capital, and high surplus value. And this is the definition of labor-intensive accumulation. Labor was managed by sardars, which were similar to the baotou in China, these overseers. But India relied also on state intervention and force much more than China did. And the workers, as I've mentioned, were similar to slaves. They were also imprisoned at 3 times the rate of the average population, because if they tried to escape, that would be a breach of their penal contracts. And planters had their own guards as well to enforce this and make sure that people didn't escape. If they tried to escape, workers would be beaten, and a bounty would be put out for those who ran away. Workers would also be beaten if they didn't meet a daily quota, and some were beaten to death. And then here, this kind of is similar to the incense sticks in China. Workers were kept to time with a gong, and they're paid wages based on socially necessary labor time. This is abstract labor, how long it should take an average worker to do a task, not how long it actually does take. More, this was applied to the task rather than time, so workers were not paid a salary for a day, but just on how much they produced. There was an aim amidst this context to push workers to complete tasks faster than average, so that the whole median average could be reset and that wages could be lowered. This is how abstract labor time works. If people start working faster, it's just to their detriment, actually, because then everyone is held to the same standard. So workers would become indebted if they couldn't meet quota. Workers were also divided by race. They were recruited from specific regions, which were deemed to have, quote, better workers. A group people called dongars were especially sought after. They were fetishized into ideal workers and as a cure to the labor shortages. And they were also seen in the most derogatory terms as being, quote, primitive, and they were viewed as having black skin. Neither did wage labor liberate women, as I mentioned, who still had to do household duties, many women chose to have abortions in this context, and because they're too busy working, right? But they still were paid less and treated worse. So there was still this idea of women's work and then a division of labor as well. And they were thought to only be able to do easy tasks, which were, quote, naturally suited for them. With the introduction of new technology, workers were dehumanized and compared to machines. Tea production was too complex for one machine, so it was broken into stages, and this is the division of labor. This makes complex tasks into simple ones. Originally, workers would use tools, but eventually tools and machines used the workers. This is a metaphor taken directly from Marx. Workers had to work overtime all the time to keep the machines running. And yeah, I might kind of skip over this, but as Indian tea prices fell, Chinese tea producers had to work even harder to keep up. And eventually, Chinese producers sacrificed quality to make their teas cheaper again. But this just shows this how they're in global competition and how prices are connected. Chapter 5 is called No Sympathy for the Merchant, the Crisis of Chinese Tea and Classical Political Economy in Late Qing China. So then there's this tea crisis in China, and prices and sales begin to plummet as Indian tea exports rise. And farmers would abandon their fields, and merchants were in a bind. So the Qing government, because tea export sales, and so was the Qing government, because tea export sales were used to support foreign wars. In response, Qing officials actually adopted key ideas of the labor theory of value, and they came to see labor, not trade, as a source of wealth. So this transformation in thinking is what Liu looks at mainly in Chapter 5. Chen Qi was an individual with the Ministry of Revenue, and he turned to ideas of political economy, classical political economy, like Adam Smith, to explain plummeting tea prices in China. This challenged the idea. Now, individuals like Chen Qi doing this and adopting ideas of Adam Smith, for example, challenged the idea of Qing modernization reforms as doomed, failed, traditional, or pre-capitalist, etc. Chen also saw that China was already enmeshed in global capitalism and subject to market imperatives. So at first, the Qing dynasty was basically mercantilist. It saw trade as a way to augment people's livelihoods. But based on these kind of, this transformation and this progression of global events and a revised thinking by people like Chen Qi, by the end of the 19th century, the Qing government came to focus on capital accumulation for its own sake. And there was a shift in focus from livelihood to accumulation and from circulation to the productivity of human labor. So, as mentioned, the Qing dynasty relied on transport taxes on tea, and when sales fell, they tried easing taxes. Liu Kunyi was an official who argued for lower, not taxes, but taxes. Lots of spelling errors here. Sorry, it's early in the morning. Merchants were focused on circulation rather than production, and the role of the merchant was very privileged, and privileged, much more than that of producer, because again, this is old views of where people thought profit came from, that they used to think that it came from trade, from the circulation of goods, which classical political economy argued against. Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I need to go faster here. So not only did the Qing government see profit as emerging from trade and the circulation of goods, but it also saw value as something that was extracted from the earth and the ground. And this was the physiocrat view that was popular not just in China, but elsewhere as well. And they emphasized the role of agriculture in this process. And this was common to other places like Japan, as we've seen, which highly valued rice, even to the point that it was basically used like money, and it was used to pay taxes in. But the Opium Wars shocked the Qing dynasty and forced them away from this view to recognize the important role of trade. And this is because Chinese silver was flowing out in return for opium. But not everyone liked this. Bian Biaodou lamented the negative impacts of an export market economy and advocated a return to growing staple crops to feed the domestic population. By the end of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was forced also to focus not just on mercantilist trade, but also on production, since there was competition from Indian tea. Zheng Guanyin was an official who emphasized this, quote, commercial warfare as a tool of foreign policy. And he too turned from trade to production. So, let's see, skip a little bit of this. And eventually then the Qing government ran out of patience with Chinese merchants, who up until this time had a very privileged role and who were really controlling all of the tea production process and getting a lot of the profits from this. But now the Qing government comes to see them as basically not very smart because they didn't understand how the market worked and they were getting ripped off, basically. So the Qing abandons their views and these mercantilist views and instead adopts a labor theory of value. And Chen Qi, as I mentioned, advocated to the Qing court to study political economy, especially after the Sino-Japanese War, and he was focused on tea production and also adopted the labor theory of value. In 1896, he wrote a tract called The Memorial on Tea, in which he advocated shifting from lowering taxes to integrating production with commerce. He also advocated using new tea machinery and studying Indian tea production methods. And he noted the hardships of the merchants at the same time, who were caught between peasants raising prices and foreigners lowering prices. But he also suggested integrating the merchants with the producers. So he pushed the merchants to invest capital in production and suggested that the peasants still be subordinate to the merchants. So he's sympathetic with the merchants a little bit, and basically he sees them as playing a key role as eventually the role of bankers, basically, to invest capital in the production process and not just profit from trade. In a supplement to Adam Smith's text, Chen wrote that the world economy was now linked through global trade and that everyone was subject to the same market imperatives and pressures. He advocated creating wealth through labor and productivity and the improvement of production methods, and this would allow China to compete globally. So even though the population of wage laborers in China at this time was still small, the nation and people's lives were fully integrated, as Chen realized, into the global market. And not only that, China was also dependent on cash crops with a high exchange value, tea, which was raised by wage labor. So Chen also advocated, in addition to tea, harvesting other cash crops such as silk, which would be grown by female factory workers. This happened in Japan, as we saw. And tea workers relied on household labor and were dependent on the credit market as well. So the important point is Chen realized how integrated already China was into the global capitalist market and how it was already an emerging capitalist economy. Okay, in chapter 6, Liu goes back to India, and he looks at the title of the chapter is here, Coolie Nationalism, the category freedom in Indian nationalist campaigns against labor indenture. So in the 20th century, competition in China and India was directly interwoven. And Western firms, less directly interwoven. So Western firms moved into Japan, Taiwan, and Ceylon as well. And so there's more competition, basically, competition for more tea harvesting regions. After the Sino-Japanese War, Japan took Taiwan as a colony, and the Mitsui Corporation invested heavily in the tea trade there. In Ceylon, firms relied on the migrant labor force of the Tamils, and each new industry was a boom-bust story which faced falling prices and harsh competition. So, in this background, a famous Indian nationalist writer called Ramkumar Vidyaratna wrote a piece called Sketches of Coolie Life. And this is describing the conditions of coolie tea laborers in India. So it's a major source about how capitalism emerged in India and about this tea industry. And Ramkumar attacked, Vidyaratna attacked tea plantations as a form of slavery. Eventually, the penal contracts were abolished in 1926, and of course, most planters were opposed to this, but Vidyaratna and other nationalists argued the ideals of liberal capitalism, of free versus unfree labor, and they used this to criticize the penal contract system. But in the process, they naturalized the idea of free wage labor. And Vidyaratna borrowed from much of what his arguments from anti-slavery abolitionist movement a century earlier. So coolie workers, as mentioned, these unfree coolie workers in the 19th century Asia were enforced through non-market means, extra economic means, force, but their livelihoods were totally tied to the market. And Asian and Indian workers were, criticized by planters as being, quote, unmodern because they didn't like to leave their home villages. So planters use this argument against free migration and the idea that Indian workers couldn't bring themselves to plantations. But within this view of laborers in India, it's important to note that workers were still clearly seen as possessing their labor power and selling it as a commodity. Anti-indentured labor activists formed the Indian National Congress in the 1880s. But abolitionists in this group were elite intelligentsia, not from the proletariat, and the founder was even invested in the tea industry. So, so there's overlap. I mean, it's a group of planters with basically different views about how best to extract surplus value, basically. And there are two subgroups within the Indian National Congress: the reform-minded Samaj and the elite Indian Association. And theirs is the elite political economy critique of the plantation. And Vidyaratna was a Samaj member. So abolitionists critiqued slavery and the penal contract system, but only because it restricted free workers' rational pursuit of profit. So it was purely economic for them, and wage labor, they argued, it was more productive than slavery. So they're not opposed to slavery per se, based on entirely moral concerns. It's just that they think it's more economic concerns. They think that this, quote, free labor contracts would be would create more profit and raise productivity. So freedom in this sense only meant freedom to sell one's labor, and it was just the opposite of slavery. Okay, let's see here. Okay, well, Vidyaratna and nationalists also divided between outside wage labor done by men and inside housework done by women. So they, in their arguments, reinforced a traditional gender patriarchy. And in the sketches of coolie life, this work by Vidyaratna, women were depicted as losing their chastity when they were raped in some scenes by plantation owners. So, but what Vidyaratna is doing with this is he's really using it as a metaphor for India itself, right? That India is being basically raped of its goods and labor by colonial Great Britain. So it's used as a metaphor for the nationalist movement itself. And it was even more than this, though, is especially indentured work, which was depicted as being especially impure and ruining women's chastity, whereas wage labor was seen as more free and was thus implicitly reaffirmed. But not all nationalists beautified pre-capitalist peasant life. Some did show the difficulties of women and poor peasants who were already in debt to rich landlords and thus formed a mobile population of agricultural day laborers, the later basis for the tea plantation proletariat. So Vidyaratna and others, they did recognize the underlying structural mechanisms of poverty, but they accepted the, quote, naturalness of wage labor and promoted it as being more modern. And note that they noted that it was an improvement for some peasants who had few choices to begin with. Eventually, some planters accepted that capitalism already guarantees labor because people are kept poor and dependent anyway. So around 1915, then, indentured labor was basically abolished, but there's still some legal basis for it, which continued, and in 1919 there were more arguments to repeal these. But the biggest cause was just the market logic of capital. After World War I, there was a big European drop in demand for tea. So now fixed contracts became a liability to planters because they had to hire all these people and then keep them on the payroll, and they couldn't arbitrarily fire them. So this is quite ironic, basically. This is the biggest reason then for the abolishment of the penal contract laws and indentured servitude, right? When there's a high demand for tea, they were very beneficial because they prevented workers from quitting, from leaving. But after demand for tea drops off, now they have to hire all these workers because the contract works both ways. So that's quite ironic. And planters tried to deal with this by cutting pay, but it sparked huge protests, and then the workers merged with the national movement and led by Mahatma Gandhi. There's a final act to repeal the penal labor contracts in 1926. And in addition to these kind of other demands of capital, another nationalist argument used against indentured labor was political. Many tea companies were British, and so there was thus a drain of Indian capital. And this was the drain thesis. It was a movement so really, in this sense as well, what the abolitionist movement was about was advocating the nationalization of capital and not its abolition. And Gandhi, too, even denounced tea workers, and defended Indian capitalists. The exploited tea worker for nationalists in the end ultimately was just a metaphor for exploited India under British colonial rule. But again, these elite nationalists are not concerned with eliminating capital. They just want to shift the hands of capital from British colonialists to Indian capitalists. Okay, and there's some shifts going on in China as well then. And Chapter 7 is called From Kohong to Comprador, China's Tea Industry Revolution and the Critique of Unproductive Labor. So in 1905, the Qing dynasty sent a mission to India to learn about modernizing the tea industry as part of its reforms. And the secretary of this mission was Liu Ying, who praised Indian mechanization and state-protected industry. Another individual is Wu Juenong, and he and other Chinese nationalists surveyed the Chinese tea industry in the early 20th century. They criticized the comprador merchants as the source of China's tea production woes. The merchants, in their view, were seen as unproductive parasites, and they really, Wu Zheyang and others, based their critique in classical political economy and views of the labor theory of value. Comprador here means a buyer, basically. They were the merchants, and they were the products of the large trading houses who bought for the Europeans. So these rich kind of seaside merchants. And at first, society and the Qing government saw their roles as being good. They were thought to help finance the state's modernization programs. But with emerging Chinese nationalism, the compradors were increasingly seen as an economic drain and also as being unpatriotic and acting as agents of imperialism. But even more than this, the critique of the comprador stemmed from a shift in economic thought. They came to be seen as anachronistic and unproductive. So it's views of classical political economy which are focused on productive labor, right? So Liu Ying and Wu Juenong tried to revive the Chinese tea industry, and they looked to the Meiji government in Japan for support and as one model as well. Wu, for instance, studied tea production in Shizuoka, and he depicted Chinese peasants and tea as being backwards and undeveloped. He was friends with Lu Xun, Mao Zedong, and other influential Chinese intellectuals and leaders. He also partnered with Chiang Kai-shek in the KMT, the Kuomintang nationalist government in Nanking. And the KMT, the Kuomintang, supported state-led industry, including tea at this time. This is really interesting history, by the way, just an aside. But people think of when you think of the emergence of socialism, quote, socialism in China, we think of this conflict between the kind of capitalist nationalists and the so-called communist CCP. But Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists supported a lot of what are considered basically socialist, state-led socialist policies. And so this is often forgotten, I think. And they began a survey that was not focused on trade, a survey of tea, not focused on trade, but on production and improvement. And they concluded that peasants' capital was dependent on wage workers, and so too were peddlers and factories who relied on loans from large tea warehouses. 1.5 million households and 9.1 million people were engaged in tea cultivation, they found, and 17.9 million relied on tea for survival in some way. Peasants also had to borrow for annual expenses, and they reaped thin profits. So market prices were their biggest threat, and merchants frequently ripped them off as well. Tea factories also borrowed from port merchants. And this is all from the findings of Liu Ying and Wu Juenong in their survey of the tea industry in China. They were usually, so warehouse merchants started as compradors who negotiated between foreign firms and inland factories, but eventually they started to act like credit institutions for peasants and factories. They're loaning money, right? They're acting like banks. Farmers need to buy, they need some tools to raise next year's crop, okay? Or they need money for seeds or whatever, and plants. They don't have that initial capital, so they have to borrow it, right? And then they'll pay all that back and then hope to make some profit based on their next year's yield, okay? So these comprador merchants who are acting as credit institutions too also have three sources of profit. One is the interest on loans that they're loaning out. 2 is the handling fees on tea transport, and 3 are the financial agreements between warehouses and factories. So they held power over the factory tea because they owned its debts. So workers anticipated harvests and yields determined the loan amount, but the warehouse would also take a share of the profit as seller before returning. So they have no risk and profited 2 to 3 times in this process. So this is all what they find out in this survey of how the tea industry works in China. So free labor was not really free at all because all peasants' crops and added labor went to the owners of capital, i.e. the warehouses, the comprador merchants. And they also learned about the magic of advance loans and realized that advance loans were in fact a kind of wage labor. So they're finding out that China is already, a capitalist economy, basically. This problem explained the poor peasants and the undercapitalized factories. All losses were passed on to the peasants. And this was Wu Juinang's survey team's analysis of the causes for China's declining tea quality and other woes of the tea industry. So in this milieu, merchants were portrayed as unproductive and parasitic, and this idea borrowed from classical political economy and Adam Smith. But this also was a kind of economic nationalism, and it drew a boundary between productive and unproductive labor. This coincided with a shift in economic thought from mercantilist to industrial capital. And the fact that this occurred in China too meant that China was already capitalist at that time, even if not highly industrial. Wu said that there was a decline in Chinese tea because they were in a capitalist system but were not acting capitalistic enough. Especially merchants were just ripping each other off without investing in production. In China, one way to reform and strengthen production and labor was through rural cooperatives. These were supported by the nationalists and conservatives and businesses as well. This was a way to give capital to producers. Wu Juinang set up in Anhui province a tea improvement center. I would say this is similar to the Kobusho in Meiji Japan in some ways, which was a way to improve production and attract capital. They purchased modern foreign machinery with this. But the merchant warehouses pushed back, and in 1936 they went on strike by withholding their capital, i.e. their loans to peasants. This threatened to throw the whole countryside into turmoil. They protested because the central government proposed central banks lend to peasants at lower interest rates rather than warehouses. Banks would lend at a 2% interest rate versus warehouses, which were lending at an astounding 15% interest rate. But warehouses striked after lending out half of the advanced loans, thus threatening to bankrupt themselves and the whole industry. This forced the government to back down, and instead the government invited the warehouses to act as the new heads of the government plan. And the strike showed the tension between different forms of capital accumulation. Merchants were not just feudal, they played a critical role in capital accumulation too. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Kuomintang used tea sales to buy weapons and to fund the war, and there was a big boom in tea sales. And Mao and the CCP were also friendly to Wu's tea policies because they needed tea too. Or more specifically, they needed the profits from tea production. So both promoted socialized forms of agriculture. So capitalism and industry were not just introduced from the outside, says Liu. India and China responded to capitalist market pressures by relying on earlier inherited methods to boost capitalist accumulation. Human relations were also transformed, and there was also much new technology that was tried first in the colonies. So they were subject to new capitalist pressures earlier, and industry was developed there first, not in the cities. So this is kind of, opposite to the standard narrative that is put forth, that new technology emerged, first in Europe in certain cases, or that capitalism emerged in the country and not, in the city and not in the country. Liu is arguing against this. All sides, the KMT, CCP, and Indian nationalists too, saw tea in economic nationalist terms as a way for the state to get capital and become strong. And the Indian elite nationalists became the new capitalists. Indian tea sales also dropped, but by then there was a switch. But after that, there was a switch from just exporting tea to more domestic consumption as well. And sorry, I didn't explain this clearly, but I moved from chapter 7 to the conclusion of the whole book as well with these. So these are my two kind of concluding statements. Okay. Well, that was a pretty long talk. As you might be able to tell, my voice is almost gone here after talking through that. There was a lot of information to cover, and I'm sure, of course, I didn't do as good of a job explaining it as Liu does himself. And it is it's a very well-written book, very, I would say, accessible for non-experts. I myself am not an expert in either Chinese or Indian history per se, but I think this book really, anyway, ties in very well to our overall study in this course of the global history of capitalism. And we're going to see, we're probably already seeing, I hope, some parallels with the introduction and development of capitalism in these regions, as we saw in Japan as well, and even its agricultural origins in England earlier. And we're going to continue developing some of these themes and looking at them further in future talks. So thank you very much for listening.